there's a push to process information so that non-technical members like myself can derive clear and actionable insights from big data analysis and to use them as a basis for decision making. So I hand you now over to Sibusiso, who will present to us his slides about the topic Humanizing Data, Scorecards for Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, Sibusiso. You can go ahead.
Good morning, Nazrana, and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So what I will do is present the slides, but these will be just excerpts for discussion later, so that you also see what they actually look like. Just see. So Afro measures progress on 12 of the 17 SDGs. So we measure questions around poverty levels, around hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, to affordable energy, economics, all the way to peace, justice, and strong institutions. Do note that it's only 12 and not 17, all 17. This is also due to the fact that we have to, when we're doing our surveys, the questions we focus on are focused around democracy and governance and some other special topics. So we can't give full information on the SDGs as such, but the majority at least. And how we've structured it, at least the concept behind the SDGs and Afro data is taking, for example, a goal like peace, justice, and strong institutions and saying, if we're to promote, how do we evaluate what people on the ground are actually thinking about this? How do they see peace and inclusive societies? So we then match the SDG to the questions we ask in our surveys. So for example, our target or indicator here for 16.1 would be significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. Our Afrobarometer indicator would be questions around tolerance for political violence, tolerance for violence against spouses and children, fear and experience of violence in different social and political contexts. So we try as much as possible to closely match the components of the SDGs. And in this way, you're able to get a picture about what actually people on the ground are asking. So one of the things when we do the surveys are, we do random surveys in different countries across the continent. So far this year, I think our target is about 40 countries, which would represent about 80% of the population of the continent. And this is quite key because generally you get surveys and polls talking about what the government has to say and other experts and so on. And so we go, when I say we do random surveys, we go on the ground. So if, let's say, I have to go to Priska in remote parts of the Northern Cape, we tend to do that too. So also we balance the data in terms of a nationally representative sample. So if it's 60% rural, that sample should reflect 60% rural so that you show a fair picture. The other thing is as well, these surveys take place, so we collect the data using tablets. And so when we input the data, we know where our field workers are. We know when the question has been completed, etc., so that you can really prove that this has been done somewhere. And so we generate also geocoded data, and that geocoded data is actually then available only on request, because in some cases you would be able to identify the person who was interviewed. Nonetheless, I can go on about the methodology, but so when we do the scorecards, we then, like I said earlier, you align the indicator, the SDG indicator, with the Afrobarometer question. For example, another one would be good health and well-being. And so we ask questions around going without healthcare, ease of access to healthcare services, the quality. this going without question covers several other aspects, so from poverty, hunger, etc. And this is part of our lived poverty index. So the lived poverty index is very basic. It asks about, does a person go without clean water? Do they go without fuel? Do they go without food? One of the other questions, medical services, and do they also go without cash? And generally, in different countries, we found a lot of people will go without cash without necessarily going without the other things. And so, when you talk about $1 a day measurement, it might miss out that a person is actually getting water, they're getting food, and they have a home over their heads. So these scorecards then are helping us to sort of see at a very basic level what is actually happening, besides the reporting that governments do. So I'll go into some examples now. So in this case, we've got SDG 1, which is no poverty, and SDG 2, which is 0. And looking at Botswana specifically, so what we've done is we've averaged this data over a 5-year period. So for example, you'll see the no poverty SDG 1 for Botswana in 2008 was sitting at about almost half, and it has declined until 2017, but started to climb a little bit in 2019. So you can actually say that Botswana is doing better at reducing poverty levels. When you then look at SDG 2, it's a bit of a mixed picture. So for example, it's been pretty stable from a statistical point of view. So 52 to 56 is only a 4% difference. So not much has changed there in terms of those who are never hungry. But you also see that there's been a slight, at least half from 2014 to 2019 reduction in those who've actually experienced hunger. So there's good progress that's happening in Botswana. You also notice the dots on the scorecards come in different colors. So for example, there's been some change. So if it's orange, there's no change. If it's red, they're doing worse. And if it's blue, they've met. So for example, the question around gender equality and financial control, Botswana has met the target already for the SDGs. And they're doing pretty well on most of the others. So when the SDG period ends, Botswana looks most likely to have met most of the targets, except around climate action, around good health and well-being, reducing a gender gap in unemployment, and also the perceived corruption in police. And if you then take, for example, the scorecard, right, and then you try and compare all the different countries, you start to see a different picture emerges. So for example, on gender equality, you see countries like Cameroon, Eswatini, Gabon, Lesotho, and Mauritius, doing much better. Whereas countries like Benin to Zimbabwe and Tunisia are slightly behind, but they in the right direction. However, you have the middling and really behind countries when it comes to gender equality. So these are 31 countries that we evaluated for the SDGs, whereas we have more countries. And part of the reason is that because of COVID lockdowns, we actually had to pause our surveys, I think for about 7 months, and then we had to come back again to do the work. Again, another SDG that's quite important, SDG 8, which is around decent work and economic growth. You see there's more countries in the wrong direction, doing worse. And this has also partially got to do with how the economy has worked in a lot of countries over this period. But I'd like to highlight a country, Namibia. Namibia has already met its target. Other countries that are close to it are Cote d'Ivoire, Mauritius, Nigeria and Sudan and Zimbabwe in this case. So you'll notice that with these SDG scorecards, you start to see countries are moving sometimes in the right direction in one area and not in another, and maybe they're stable in another. And so one of the things that comes through is that not many countries are going to meet the targets that are set out at the rate that they're going. However, there are certain targets that will be met by a few countries. So there's a question then about what do we do? What interventions need to take place to make this happen? So for example, we hear SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Mauritius and Morocco are the ones that are sort of meeting the target, but not quite there. When it comes to climate action, so climate questions we had never asked in Afrobarometer before until our seventh round. And so we've been asking them ever since. And the question here that we utilize is, have you heard about climate change? Or haven't you heard about it? The other question is, do you think climate change is making life in your country better or worse? And generally, we found that most people know what climate change is, and most people describe it as having more floods, more drought, and so in many ways, you realize you would think a concept like climate change might be difficult for people on the ground to understand, but they understand it very well. And in this case, you see that most countries are in the green column. So that means that the country is doing better at making people aware that climate change is actually taking place. And also, again, in terms of it affecting people's lives, you actually are seeing that come through as well. However, there are a few outliers like Burkina Faso, Ghana, Liberia, Malawi, Tunisia, Nigeria, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. When it comes to SDG 16, which I would say for Afrobarometer, this is our bread and butter issue when you talk about democracy and governance. The indicator we asked here was about trust in the police, judiciary, and parliament, as well as the reduction of perceived corruption in these institutions. Here you have a very different picture. So the column is mostly red for both questions. However, again, you have countries that are moving in the right direction, like Ghana, Morocco, Mozambique, to Tanzania, in terms of increased trust in these institutions. When we look at the perceived corruption is usually high in a lot of countries across the different regions. However, in a country like Ghana to Morocco, again, Nigeria and Tanzania, the direction is moving towards improvement. So again, it's also the thing about perception as well is depends on the institution that a person is actually dealing with. So most of us will tend to deal more with the police almost on a daily basis. We'll deal with a local councillor. We'll also deal with, we much less deal with the judiciary and parliament. And so what happens on the ground on a daily basis really colors your view around what is, what about institutions broadly. So I'm going to stop here so that we can have more discussion, but you can go to our website and have a look. We've got questions on a whole lot of African public opinion. So it's afrobarometer.org. You can also utilize our online data analysis tool. So all the data we've collected from 1999 to 2021 is on there, and you can play around, etc. And the page will tell you how to work with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibusiso. That was very insightful. I learned a lot just going through that. But also, I think, for me, it was also scary looking at the progress of the various countries and comparing them. The spotlights that, that we compare each country. I think then my question then would be is, can you compare the spotlights to other countries? And if not, why not?
So, I mean, what we've tried to do with the SDG scorecards is not necessarily to make a comparison between the countries, but to look at the country over time itself. So we can compare them, but it would, from the way we've analyzed it, we realized it would be unfair to say, oh, well, Botswana is better than Zimbabwe, because the factors within each of the countries are just so specific that it would not be a fair measurement. So we've emphasized looking at the country over time to say, if Botswana is improving from 2008 to 2019, what is actually happening in that country? Because sometimes, Zimbabwe might have a larger population. They may have had a drought, and Botswana may have not had the same issues around, let's say, hunger. So it is very complex. I would say you take these scorecards and you use them in complement with other measurements around the SDGs. I think then you'll get a much broader picture. Also, these are perceptions on the ground, and so they're very time bound. So for example, as we know, like with elections, like Lesotho, for example, had the elections last week. This new party that has won the elections, when we did the survey, did not exist. So the survey would have not shown them coming up at all. And now you have them after 7 months, they're in power. So it would be difficult to say, oh, well, why did the survey pick that up? But so it's very time bound. So if I say the Lesotho survey was done in February, you need to think about the conditions in February of that period to be not necessarily, I don't want to use the word correct, but to be much more specific.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I feel like, you can't really make specific comparisons between countries. You'd find some countries on the red, and still being on the red, but progressing intermittently. And I think that's where the focus should be. Going back to your presentation, you mentioned you guys having to stop during COVID, and how did that affect the data collection and accuracy in evaluating the progress of the scorecards? Everybody had to adapt. And specifically to COVID, more and more people realize that in this digital era that we now live in, that data is the new gold. So, and then my second question is then why is it important then to humanize this data?
Yeah, so with COVID, we stopped for 7 months. And what happened was we had completed about, give or take, 16 countries that before we stopped for COVID. All our questionnaires are the same for every country. So that's how we're also able to compare. However, after the lockdowns ended, what we did was then added COVID questions now to the countries that were left, because we wanted to gauge what was happening. And one of the things that comes through is from the COVID questions is that the impact has been quite huge. And so if you look at a scorecard for countries post the lockdowns, they might look like they're doing worse on a lot of indicators. And the lockdowns really impacted on the economy, social issues, etc. And so what might seem like a regression over the short term maybe stalled some progress that had been taking place. So like, for example, Botswana would be interesting to see now that we're doing another survey there to see if where they are in the green zone, have they stayed there or have they regressed a bit? So those things are quite big events, or even a recession might completely take something out. And I think, to your second question about humanizing the data around SDGs, this is supposed to help people's lives improve. And on a daily basis, what happens to people. And I think this data is quite important for pinpointing this out. So if you're saying somebody is going without healthcare, what does it look like? Does it mean they actually have a clinic that they can go to, but there are no doctors or nurses, or does it mean there's no medication, etc.? It starts to make it more specific where the gaps and the issues are. So in a way, it could be utilized to pinpoint much more specifically and more cleanly than to just say, oh, well, we're going to build 5 hospitals. Do we need 5 hospitals, or do we need 2 that really reach the population that requires them?
Yeah, I completely agree with you when you say, humanizing the data it's more of a qualitative instead of a quantitative approach. And I love the fact that you can say a story from your scorecards. And that takes away from the traditional approach from data. Going back to the COVID-19, and you mentioned also early in your presentation, your field workers and the field workers having to go and get these servers in rural Africa. That most probably posed an impediment with COVID as well. And the progress in that country could have also been affected by retrieving that data specifically from rural Africa. I think then can I then ask you then, which indices do you use to define data privacy as shown in your presentation, and at the level in which people trust the data?
So I mean, one of the things with our protocols, what we do, so for example with COVID, we had to actually change our protocols to take into account that there has to be wearing of masks, people have to wear t-shirts or whatever to say who they are. Interestingly, around who people think we are and whether they can trust us. So we actually have our field workers have to introduce themselves and say, I am so-and-so, I'm from Afro barometer, conducting this survey, and initially. And then at the end of the question, later in the questionnaire, we also have a question we use to track trust around who people think we are. So we ask them, so who do you think sent us? And generally in most countries on the continent, people would actually say, the government sent you. Even after you've introduced yourself and said who you are. But the other part is that people are very willing to talk and to express their views. And I think that's a good sign, because, generally people only hear from politicians around election time, where they can express themselves. But for a lot of people to be able to sit down with somebody and, go through a number of questions about what's going on is also affirming in some ways that somebody is listening. And that's part of the goal for Afrobarometer, to get this information to the people who need it. So the policymakers, to civil society, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you say this because I remember reading yours report for SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Corruption for South Africa specifically, and the impact that it had to the audience and to South Africans in changing their vote, perhaps, and the perceptions that they had regarding corruption in South Africa. So we have 2 minutes to wrap up. Is there anything that you want to say before I conclude?
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to be taking this further, so not just looking at the SDG scorecards. So we'll be also looking at the African Union's Agenda 2063. Some of the things are quite similar and some are slightly different. So we also finishing our surveys for round 9, and hopefully we'll have 40 new country data sets to share in the next few weeks. So yeah, and the South Africa survey is going to take place in November this year. So there'll be new information as well on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, and I think it was an insightful session, and we can't wait to have a look at your new research. So yeah, we look forward to your continued support and hoping to see you next year for the Pathway 17 Summit. I must also say that the audience really was interested in your presentation. They found that the data formatting was very visual and easy to read. So very grateful for that. And thank you for your participation in our summit this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.